Hello, Psychology of Learning students. So this week we're going to be talking about Chapter 10. It's week 12 if you do not include spring break as a numbered. In the syllabus, I believe I had spring break as a particular number, which would make this week, week 13. And so we're going to be talking about observational learning. Next week, we're going to cover chapters 11 and 12, and then the following week will be your exam 3. Now, remember that exam 3 is the exam that needs to be proctored. So you'll have to either come to campus and take the exam here using the proctoring site will have the passcode that you'll need to get into the exam. Or if you can't come to campus, then you need to schedule an appointment with one of the off-site testing proctored sites like Examine or ProctorU. Now, often Examine and ProctorU, if you don't give them at least 2 weeks notice, you get charged like an urgency fee or something. So during the first week of class, you were asked to figure out who was going to proctor it and give us that information. If you haven't done that, make sure you do so immediately, especially if you're going to be taking it to Examine or ProctorU or something like that. All right, well, let's get to the material. Let me screen share the PowerPoint slides for Chapter 10. You all know how to get to these by now. Oops, simple again. Here we go. All right, and we'll enable this and make them big. Okay, here we go. So we're moving away in this chapter. We're moving away from conditioning, from classical conditioning and operant conditioning, and we're moving to observational learning. Now, what is observational learning? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in these 2 videos. So in video 1, I'm going to talk about social observational learning and asocial observational learning. I'm also going to talk about imitation and then 2 variables that impact the impact learning, observational learning, task difficulty, and the skill level of the model. Then in the second video, I'm going to talk about variables that affect, variables that affect learning, like who are we more likely to model afterwards, and the characteristics of the observer. And then I'm going to talk about 2 theories of observational learning, and then end with some applications, and that's in the second video. Okay, so to begin this video, I want to begin by defining what we mean by observational learning. So the most complete definition, according to your book, is learning by observing events and their consequences. Now, oftentimes we'll learn by observing a person doing a behavior. That's the event. And that person we're going to call a model. And these are the social observational learning. There's also asocial observational learning where you learn where there is no model. But a lot of the social observational learning includes a model. So the model is the person who's performing a behavior that we end up learning from. They're the ones that perform the behavior, and they're the ones that get punished or reinforced for it. They're the ones that get the consequence, and we're observing this happening. Okay, so with social observational learning, we're going to observe the behavior of another individual and the consequences that happen to that individual. There's a lot of research done looking at problem solving when it comes to social observational learning. And initially, a lot of it was done with animals, and it seemed as though animals could not learn by watching another animal perform a problem solving task. But that quickly changed with the turntable paradigm. This is just one example where cats were actually supposed to try to solve a problem where there's a turntable, a bicycle wheel, and there was a raisin or some piece of food that was put on the turntable. But in order to get to the food, you needed to turn, the cat needed to take the spokes on the wheel and move, attach to the spokes and move the wheel, turn the wheel toward themselves until the food was there, and then they could grab the food. And what they found is that cats who were able to watch a cat problem solve successfully learned much more quickly how to solve the problem when they were put in the box in the turntable paradigm. And the more time that they were able to watch a cat successfully solve the problem, the fewer trials it took for them to solve the problem. So we see that, boy, it does seem as though cats in this paradigm are able to watch a model, observe a model, perform a behavior, get a consequence, in this case, the food, and then they're able to observe that behavior and then learn from it. So they're more likely to do it. Okay. Not only have we found social observational learning to work with behaviors. So for example, this slide with the elevator. There's been some research done. If a person enters an elevator, let's say there's just one other person in there and it's a Confederate, someone who's in on the experiment with the experimenter. And rather than facing the elevator doors, the Confederate faces the wall behind. And then you look at the person who just went into the elevator. What are they likely to do? Are they likely, through social observational learning, to turn and face the wall also? Or do they do what they previously knew to do, which was to face the elevator doors? And what you find over and over is that most people will turn around and imitate the model, imitate the person who's there. So we've shown with animals, with people, with problem-solving behaviors, with other kinds of behaviors like how you stand in an elevator, there seems to be some social observational learning. But there's also some social observational learning that we found with non-behaviors. Now, what do I mean by here? By that, one example that your book talks about has to do with taste in art. So Levy and his colleagues took preschool to sixth graders and had them watch a model get to select a picture from a pair. So this model, who was an adult, got to look at two pictures and say, I prefer this one. And then another two, I prefer this one. And then another two, I prefer this one. I prefer this one. And these preschoolers and first grade, second grade, all the way up to sixth grade, got to watch this model do this, make their selection of which picture they preferred from the pair of artwork. And what they found is, over time, the observers, these preschool kids, these sixth grade kids, they learned how they ended up imitating the preferences that they watched the model have. And they were able to abstract it. So if the model liked things that were more like abstract art, then they were more likely to pick more abstract art. If the model was showing a preference for something that was very colorful, they would start selecting and preferring things that were colorful. So it's behaviors and even preferences that we can learn through social learning. Okay, so it says here, all children pick the picture the model liked best when asked to pick their favorite. Okay, now how does this happen? Well, we think it happens through vicarious reinforcement and punishment. Basically, when we watch someone else do a behavior and get reinforced, then not only does it increase the likelihood of that person to do the behavior again, but it's going to increase the likelihood of us to do that behavior. Similarly with punishment, when we watch a model do a behavior and then get punished, not only is that person, the model, less likely to do that behavior again, but we're going to be less likely to do the behavior. And that's the silly thing here about the ticket, him getting punished for not having a ticket, and everyone's pulling out their ticket very, very quickly. So we call that vicarious reinforcement and punishment. We're getting reinforced and punished by watching someone else in a situation give a behavior and then get the consequence. But there's also asocial observational learning. Now, what is this? Asocial observational learning is when we learn when there's no model. There's no person or animal showing us how to solve the task. But we do get some information from the environment that gives us ideas of how to solve the task. So there's no vicarious reinforcement because there's no model doing something that then gets rewarded, or no model doing something that then gets punished. But the consequences are still important. So an example here is you're asked to solve a puzzle box problem, and the problem involves figuring out how to open a box and get what's inside. While the problem is being set up, you notice that a hidden door accidentally opens. Now, when you go to solve the problem, you didn't watch someone open the door, but because you know that door is there, you're likely to open it, and you'll know how to open it because you were able to watch that. So it's through that observational learning that you learn how to do that, even though you didn't watch a person or an animal or someone have this happen. I believe an example that your book uses is animals that were able to watch another animal turn over a log in order to get the ants that were underneath it to be able to eat the ants. We would call that social observational learning. But if the wind caused the log to roll over and reveal that there are ants there, then the animal's still likely to turn over the log, because now the animal has learned through asocial observational learning that there are ants underneath that log if you can get to them. And of course, that leads us to the question, is social learning truly social? If you don't need a person there, then with social observational learning, are we just learning techniques? We're not learning from the model, we're just getting information. And the answer to that question, we don't know. And it's really an unanswered question in the field. The ghost condition, this is like the asocial observational learning. The example, like where the wind moves the log over, seems to be just as effective as when you watch another animal move the log over. So in that instance, it seems as though both are equally effective, but there are other situations where one has an advantage over the other. And so really we don't know the answer to that, okay? But there certainly are differences between social and asocial learning. One of the things that happens with social observational learning that does not happen with asocial observational learning is imitation. So in the social observational learning, we're going to imitate a model. We're going to behave in a way that resembles the behavior of a model. So we're going to do what they did in order to get what they get. Does that kind of make sense? Imitation is sometimes based off the reinforcing nature of the behavior, like you get the ants that are under the log, but not always. In fact, there's some research, you'll see it when you read the book, that shows that just being reinforced for imitating behaviors will lead you to imitate other behaviors that aren't reinforced. So it may be that just imitating people's or other animals' behaviors in and of itself becomes reinforced, becomes something that we do. So it's more than just what they're doing, but the fact that they are doing it and we can imitate it. So Dr. Stephanie Stern, who came up with these slides, used an example where she said that she would drive to school every morning the same way that her mother would drive to work, even though there were faster routes. So she's using a less effective kind of imitation. We call that over imitation. And your book will give an example where they did a study with children where I think there were dinosaurs in a jar. And they showed the students how to a model showed the students how to get the dinosaur out of the jar, but performed some steps to do that were irrelevant, that you didn't need to do. And they even asked the children, which of those steps were done were irrelevant? In other words, which ones weren't needed for the model to be able to get the dinosaur? And the kiddos were accurate. They could say they didn't need to do this and they didn't need to do that. But when they gave them the jars, the kids did them anyway. So we tend to repeat even the irrelevant acts that are modeled. And again, why? Maybe because just imitating people is reinforcing to us, like I was talking about before. And so that explains why we might over imitate. When the act of imitating itself is reinforced by the environment because it frees up cognitive resources, or because in many instances we've been rewarded in the past, so we think it's going to work here too, we're going to call that generalized imitation. And it makes, we're more likely to use generalized imitation when we're less certain of our behavior and if it's been rewarded in the past. Another possibility that can explain imitation and social observational learning has to do with mirror neurons. So if you've taken general psychology or biopsychology, or even sensation and perception, you've learned how we have neurons in our brains that actually start to communicate with one another as though we're performing a task when we watch another person perform a task. They even will fire if we're thinking about performing a task. It's one of the reasons why athletes are asked to visualize performing a behavior. Even in the visualizing of the performing of the behavior, oftentimes, I'm sorry about that. Let me get that. Often in the visualizing of a behavior, uh, especially a performance type thing, the neurons are firing and wiring together. And it's almost as if you get a little bit better just by visualizing it. Well, these mirror neurons occur anytime we're watching someone else do something. They're firing in us as though we're doing it. And that could be another reason why imitation leads to so much learning and why social observational learning works so well. Now let's talk about a couple of variables that impact observational learning. And one has to do, how difficult is the task difficulty. Okay, do you think observational learning is, you should use it more with a difficult task or an easy task? Just give it a minute. What do you think? Okay, so let's try to answer this. If the task is difficult, well, then it's going to be harder to solve the task through observational learning, through any kind of learning, because it's a more difficult task. So it's going to be harder to get the correct answer on a difficult task than an easy task. But what we find is that when the task is difficult, we are more likely to use observational learning, and it works better. Okay, so we're more likely to succeed in doing it ourselves if we have a model. The more difficult the task, the less learning that occurs during the observation, because it's so hard. It's harder to pay attention. It's hard to remember all of it. It's hard to keep that in mind and everything else because it's harder. Like, it's going to be harder if you do it alone too. But we are more likely to be successful if we use social observational learning with a more difficult task than a simple task. Sort of like with a simple task, you can do it without seeing how someone else did it. So it's not needed. The other question that we look at a lot is it better to watch a skilled model do the behavior and get it correct? So you watch, let's say, someone who knows what they're doing really well, and let's say you get to watch them succeed 15 times. Is that better than watching someone who is more of a novice and they do it 15 times, but 7 of the times they do it wrong and 7 of the times they do it correctly? One could argue when you get to watch someone who's not as good, not only do you learn what to do, but you also learn what not to do. So I could make a really good argument that watching an unskilled model would be, more beneficial than a skilled model. But at this point in time, we really don't know the answer. That research shows mixed results. Sometimes in some situations, the skilled model leads to better performance, and sometimes in other situations, the unskilled model leads to better results. So it's one of those questions that we just don't know right now. Okay, but I'd like you to think of an example where the skilled is better and when the unskilled is better. I think that will help you to remember how both are useful. And that is it for the first video. When you're done looking at this and you've answered the study guide questions having to do with this, you can watch the second video. Again, as always, if you have any questions, maryd@cameron.edu, especially on your behavior modification project. Several of you are emailing me, which is wonderful, saying, I'm not sure about this, and what about that? Is this an appropriate behavior to use? And for some of you, I'm able to just email you back quickly because they're quick questions or easy questions. For some of you, I'm like, ooh, I think it might be better if we have a Zoom meeting or a phone call so that we can talk through it. So please, please, I know last week I was unavailable some because my mother-in-law passed away. And so last week we had the funeral and lots of out-of-town guests, and It was very busy, but this week it is completely calmed down, and I will be able to get back to you in a very quick way, and we can set up appointments and really talk about your projects. The sooner you get to working on it now, the better off you'll be, because it's not due until April 30th, but you're going to turn around and it's there. And it takes a couple of weeks to do the assignment, because you're going to have to observe your behavior before you start reinforcing it and classically conditioning it, and then employ those and see what happens. So, and then you're going to need time to write it up. So it's not something you can do in 1 week. You need a lot of time. So you definitely want to start thinking about it and get any questions that you have answered. And it might be for some of you that you try a behavior and that it doesn't work very well. So I know several of you are using swearing. Swearing works really well if you want to reduce the amount of swearing you have. Works really well if you swear a couple times a day. If you are only swearing a couple times a week, then it's not going to be a good behavior to try to get rid of. And certainly trying to change someone else's behavior, a pet's behavior, or a child's behavior, that is not going to work nearly as well, because you're not going to have access to the thoughts and feelings that that cat or dog or child had before they did the behavior or after they did the behavior. So it's going to make it much harder. I strongly recommend not doing someone else's behavior or a pet's behavior. I strongly recommend picking one of your own behaviors. So maryd@cameron.edu. All right.